Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tweeds and Checks of Scotland, a Loudoun County Public Library program with Melissa Weaver-Dunning. I'm Lorraine Moffa, Programming Coordinator at Loudoun County Public Library and your host for the program. Please feel free to share with me your comments and questions for the speaker by typing them in the chat box, or you can request that I unmute your microphone and you can ask Melissa directly. It is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Weaver-Dunning. She is a traditional hand weaver and spinner with 40 years of experience working on antique equipment to produce 18th and 19th century style textiles. Melissa began her traditional textile study with Scottish master weaver Norman Kennedy and carries on this rich tradition in her own teaching. Melissa is an avid tartan and linen weaver and a lover of wool who loves sharing her passion for weaving and spinning with students. Welcome back, Melissa.
Hi, Lorraine. Thank you. Thanks for having me back. So I'm excited today to share this topic with you all because this is a topic that I'm very excited about. And Lorraine, are we going to record this program?
Yes, we are recording the program.
Oh, great. Okay. I just wanted to make sure because I always forget to start mine when it's my job. So this is a topic I'm really excited about. It's one that I have been thinking about and researching and investigating for a couple of decades now. And as a weaver, it's a very interesting realm of traditional weaving to get into. So, and I want to talk about district checks first. And to do that, I really kind of need to talk a little bit about the history of tartan. So we're going to start with this map of Scotland, which shows us the Highlands and the Lowlands. And for the most part, tartan is a Highland cloth, but the district checks started in the lowland areas. And to talk about tartan, it's never hurts to talk a little bit about Bonnie Prince Charlie. This is a portrait of him that was actually painted long after he had lived and died, and was based on a scene in a Sir Walter Scott novel, but it's a wonderful painting. And he's quite regal in his tartan. And this is a little illustration from a history textbook. And these are men who are on their way to, well, actually, they're in shackles and in pairs, but they're on their way to fight for Bonnie Prince Charlie. And every one of them has a different tartan. And oh, I don't know what's the word for this. The concept of named tartans is much later than we imagine. Most people who showed up to fight at the Battle of Culloden wore whatever tartan they possessed. Most men only owned one kilt, unless they were well-to-do. And this is a portrait from after Culloden, and this is a British military troop based in Scotland, and they are outfitted in a uniform which includes the Black Watch tartan, which is one of the military tartans. And this is a situation where you see a whole army dressed in a tartan, but the individual crofters and just regular townspeople who fought for Bonnie Prince Charlie all wore different tartans. And this is Maurier's painting of the Battle of Culloden. And this painting has been found to have, I'm trying to find my right page. This has 22 different tartans have been identified in this painting. So the British troops are outfitted in uniform, but the men who arrived wore whatever tartans they had. And they were identified by the cockades they wore in their hat or by broom, heather, or gorse pinned to their coats. There is no evidence of a clan tartan at or before this time. So there was the Act of Prescription, which banned tartan completely. That act was lifted, and after that time, 1782, the act was repealed, and then people started getting interested in tartan again. Sir Walter Scott, in particular, did a lot of work to sort of rehabilitate the image of the Scottish people through his novels, but also King George IV came to visit Edinburgh in 1822, and he was outfitted in full tartan regalia, and all of the well-to-do people who he was going to interact with in Edinburgh also rushed to have tartans, and they literally wrote letters to the mills and said, I would like 20 yards of my family tartan, and if you don't have one by that name, choose one and make it so. So this is kind of the era in which naming tartans started to come forward. This is an etching of the Sobieski brothers, who about the time of King George IV's visit in 1822, they appeared in Scotland, started using the names John Sobieski Stuart and Charles Edward Stuart. They declared themselves to be the legitimate grandsons of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and later claimed to have been born at Versailles. They also claimed, and this is the important part, to have a copy of an ancient book of tartan patterns. In 1837, Queen Victoria began her reign. In 1842, the Sobieski brothers published the Vestiarium Scoticum, which contained many newly discovered old clan tartans. It was purported to be a copy of an older book that was a copy of an even older book. But this is really the point at which tartans started to be named, in between the 1820s and the 1840s. And this is just an amusing cartoon which shows that the question of what is worn under a soldier's kilt is a very long one, and the answer has always, wait, I gotta get this right. The question is, what is worn under your kilt, sir? And the answer is, nothing at all is worn. It is all in perfect condition. But anyway, here's a cartoon from the Victorian era. And we've got a lovely Rayborn portrait because these are just so beautiful. So we're going to move over to district checks now. So this is a wonderful painting of a shepherd up in the Scottish Highlands, and you can just barely see that he has a sort of shawl wrapped around him. And this shawl, I had to add these because they're just beautiful. So more sheep, more hills. This shawl is called a shepherd's check, and it was typically a two-color dark and light check. Today, a shepherd check is seen as a black and white check, but actually the earliest ones were probably a dark reddish brown and a yellowish white because of the way that the type of sheep that were available, the darkest color that those sheep naturally occurred in, and there was a practice of tarring wool to preserve it both on the animal, and it was hard to wash off, so the sheep was quite yellowish. And here we have another shepherd with his shepherd check. Now, the purpose of this shepherd's shawl was to sometimes keep the shepherd warm, but mostly it was used to wrap orphaned lambs in, and to carry lambs that were weak until they could get to a place that was more protected from the weather. So it was a very utilitarian garment, quite a long shawl. And I imagine it was also used similarly to a kilt as a blanket at night if it were available. And here we have an image of a very traditional early shepherd's check shawl. So the check itself is in the main body of the shawl, and there are wider stripes at the bottom. And this results in this lovely corner block. And this is also an old shawl that at some point was cross-stitched with the owner's initials. So we have this traditional design, and this type of shawl has been found throughout Europe. So it's a very old, very traditional pattern. And I just had to include this painting because it's so charming. So his shawl maybe has smaller checks and a dark over check, but it still has the stripes at the edges. And here is our shepherd feeding a bottle lamb, who's possibly an orphan lamb. So the top fabric here is a shepherd check, and it is, in this case, 4 black threads and 4 white threads striped all the way across the warp, and the same sequence woven in the weft. The next item that we see is a slightly different pattern, which is one of the very first of the estate tweeds. So what you have is people coming into Scotland after the Battle of Culloden, after the Jacobite uprising was over. the King of England granted many of the lands of the disgraced Highland chiefs over to people who had been loyal to him. And some of them came from Lowland Scotland and some came from England. And there was a woman at one of these houses who invented the Glenurquhart check, which is the bottom fabric. And she lived in Lewiston in Glenurquhart, and she had the idea that she knew she couldn't have a tartan that belonged to her family, but she wanted to have a fabric that would represent her estate, or her husband's estate, their estate. And so she had the idea to take that shepherd check and have a section of the warp be 4 white, 4 black, 4 white, 4 black, 4 white, 4 black, and have the next section be 2 white, 2 black, 2 white, 2 black, 2 white, 2 black. So you have a group of 6 of the larger check and then 12 of this smaller 2x2 check. And that is the cloth at the bottom of this fabric. And the story is that she drew it in the dust for the weaver to explain what it was she had in mind. And this Glenurquhart check, which is also known as a Glen check, still appears in sportswear fabrics to this day. My father had 3 Glen plaid check suits, and I find it all the time in thrift stores, women's skirts, women's jackets, men's jackets, all kinds of fabric. So if you haven't noticed it before, you may start to notice it now. And this is considered a color and weave effect. Now, the fabric in the middle of this is just taking that shepherd check, only in this case it's 8 threads of black and 8 threads of white, and adding an over check of red, just a big window pane. And that made a district, an estate check for yet another estate. And so people started designing different checks. This is the same one. I think this is Abercalder. This is just a small section of it. And this slide is specifically to show you that woven fabric coming off the loom is fairly open, and the design is quite clear. If it's heavily fulled or walked, heavily wet finished, then it can become quite thick, almost windproof fabric. And that's what you see in the fabric swatch above. So here's another image of that Glenurquhart check, or the Glen check. This is yet another estate check on top that has been designed based on the shepherd check, but with a red that substitutes for the lighter color. And by changing the colors to a sort of off-white and brown, it becomes a really beautiful check. This is considered a gun club check. Gun club checks are typically 3 colors. And again, here we have this shepherd check, but every other black stripe has been replaced by, in this case, green. This is a lovely check which has a yellowish line that goes through one section. It's kind of like they squashed one of the light areas and replaced it with yellow. So it's just a variation on that shepherd check still. And now we're getting into what are called barleycorn, or I often call these 2x2 twills, because they'll have 2 threads of one color and 2 threads of another. Or sometimes, I think this one might have 2 whites and a black and a red. And it has a large overcheck. This is not a plaid. It has different colors, or it's not a tartan. It has different colors in the warp and the weft threads. And interestingly, the more I explored this type of tweed, the more I realized that any complexity in these fabrics is in the warp so that it can be woven fairly quickly. And when we move closer into the present and look at some Harris Tweed fabrics, I'll talk about that a little bit more too. So this is an old tweed. The bottom swatch is pretty much like what the original swatch. I used the colors that I could come as close to. And then the next time I wove this, I thought, what if I shifted the colors around a little better so they blended better? So I'm much happier with the swatch at the top. This is the same Glenurquhart, but with alternating a red section, and most of it's black and white, but one of the check sections 4x4 rather than 2x2, using red instead of white in the weft, and it just makes yet another pattern. So this fabric was originally used to outfit the groundsmen, the men who worked outdoors in the stables, in the woods, so that the people on an estate could identify their own people and identify people who were strangers, who were poachers coming in to shoot game where they shouldn't be. By and by, this became the basis of sportswear, all these different tweed patterns. And this is actually part of an illustration for an ad. But I love this, all these combinations of tweeds in the sportswear that these people are wearing to go hunting. And this is a label that I found for travel rugs. People used to always keep a nice, strong, heavy blanket in their carriage and later in their automobiles. And so a travel rug you could tuck across your lap on a chilly night. So now we're going to look at Harris tweed. So Harris tweed is certainly the most famous tweed in the world. Harris tweed has been originally hand spun and always hand woven in the Outer Hebrides Islands. And here's a different mill. Here's Pringle's mill with another lovely lady out, gone shooting, or at least gone out with a shooting party. It's hard to say. So this is a piece of Harris tweed in the foreground, and then a somewhat coarser cloth that is designed based on similar colors in the background. And this is that same sequence, but with two different weft sequences. So by changing the colors that you weave across this cloth, in this case it's 2 gold, 2 brown, 2 gold, 2 brown, it completely changes the nature of the cloth. And this is part of what's really fascinating about the world of tweed. So we're going to look at some Harris tweed coats. I have long shopped a lot in thrift stores. And when I moved from Vermont to Virginia in 1982, I started finding Harris tweed women's coats in the thrift stores. All of a sudden, I had never seen them before, and all of a sudden they started popping up. And I finally decided that the ladies who had invested in those coats earlier in their lives were switching over to down coats, which had finally become a little more fashionable and a little more flattering. And they were giving up their heavy coats that were for something that was much lighter, but equally warm. So their loss was my gain. And the first one that we're looking at is just a straight twill cloth with a turquoise warp and an emerald green weft. And it's quite a dazzling cloth. It's a beautiful coat. All of these coats are quite stunning, but this one, some of them have such bright colors, unlike the sort of grays and brown tweeds that you see, you know, in academics wearing. So this is another lady's coat, and there are 4 colors in the warp, and I think just 2 colors in the weft that alternate, 2 picks of a turquoise and 2 picks of a green, back and forth, back and forth. And one of the interesting things about most of these Harris tweeds is that it's not a straight twill and it's not a broken twill. It's, I guess you could call it a broken twill, but it kind of goes 1, 3, 2, 4 through a twill sequence. It has a bump in it that makes mixes up the colors really beautifully and really evenly. And there's no very clear diagonal when you're looking at the cloth. It's quite tricky to figure out from the cloth what the actual weave structures is. This is yet another coat that's in this beautiful kind of lichen greeny gray color with a darker gray and this wonderful sort of mustardy greeny olivey color tweed cloth. And I'll talk a little bit more about the yarn later on. This is one of my favorite coats. It has these beautiful autumn colors in it with a beigey gray that really grounds the deeper colors. And you see how you can see the straight twill in this one. You can actually follow a diagonal line, but the sequence of the colors in the warp really break up that line. It's very effective as a cloth. This is another women's coat, rather dazzling. I think this came from the 60s. Lots of color in here, but the weaving is 4 red, 4 purple, 4 red, 4 purple repeated. The colors in the weft and the colors in the warp intermingle to create this lovely all over kind of orchid look. And this is a great, this is a Harris Tweed double-breasted women's coat. And actually one of my daughters took this to Western Massachusetts to go to college. And when I got it back, which I guess I should be glad I got it back, the hem was all shot out and most of the lining is in pretty bad shape. The coat itself, being nearly indestructible, is just beautiful. But I love this gold and red herringbone. It's just very classy, but also kind of dazzling. And this is my current coat collection. So I didn't get close-ups of every single one of them, but you can see what a variety there is in colors. And there are some really nice little details. Some of them have double collars or double pockets, different kinds of, the styling is quite different from one to the next.
Melissa, those are just gorgeous.
So I go back.
Oh, yes, they're so beautiful. And how many of those coats would have been made? I mean, were these mass produced? Were they?
Well, they were produced in quantity. I don't think they made as many as they did of men's coats. And what I'm curious about is how many were exported to the United States, because there may have been more of them in the British Isles. It's likely that there were, but obviously some of them made their way to the United States. And actually, we're in Loudoun County with the Loudoun County Public Library. One of these coats has a label in it above the Harris Tweed label that identifies it and each has an individual number.
Wow.
But there's a label for Rafflow's department store in Leesburg. And when I moved here in 1982, that store wasn't there anymore. But my husband, who had been here maybe 10 years longer, remembered Rafflow's department store, and we certainly knew the Rafflows. So that was that was a really exciting find.
Do you still find them around?
Not as many. Once in a while I do, but there was this influx. They were just flowing into the thrift stores for a little while. And I think I found them all around this area. Yeah, they're really quite nice. A couple of them fit me, which is also exciting. My daughter, who took the herringbone, also took the purple one to college, but she did bring them.
I love that color.
So, yeah, she was very stylishly dressed on campus.
I bet.
Okay, so I just wanted to talk about a few of the basic tweed designs, and one of them is herringbone, which has this zigzag effect. And this is actually from a small bespoke fabric company in Donegal in Ireland, but it's a classic herringbone. And the thing about herringbone is you can put on a white warp, a gray warp, a black warp, and whatever color you choose to weave across it is going to give you all these different variations. So the three in the upper left-hand corner have the same or very similar colored yarns for both the warp and the weft. So it's a very subtle herringbone, but you can see how the other color combinations can go from quite graphic to just subtly beautiful. And when you add color to this, they're really quite dazzling. And this is just a few more swatches. I love these shades of blue. It's like the very darkest navy with a slightly lighter color across it at the bottom, and a dark with a much lighter weft for the next one. And then the top one has an even lighter color. So there's so many possibilities. And even a single warp can yield a lot of different options. You could put on a warp and weave 6 scarves that were all a completely different color. And then we have what's called barleycorn tweed, sometimes called 2x2. This looks more like a 1x1. This is definitely a plain weave. So sometimes you'll have these very simple, pebbly kind of looking cloth. And this is a little more old-fashioned. We don't see a lot of sportswear with this, but periodically it'll come up. And there are certainly very tweedy yarns that will kind of imitate this, but not have quite the same contrast. And then on the left-hand side, we have variations on that gun club check using multiple colors. And in these cases, there are more colors in the warp than in the weft, which makes it faster to weave. And on the right, we have some straight twills, but with what you might call a window pane effect, of some stripes, periodic stripes in the warp that are then repeated in the weft, but not to make squares, but really to make rectangles. But your combination of colors, one of the things that's exciting about sometimes the very plainest tweed, when you get close to it, like these fabrics on the right, you'll find there's a line of pink or a line of turquoise or some little pop color that from a distance you can't see, but it makes the cloth just that much more interesting. These are all these swatches we're looking at in this section are from Skye weavers on the Isle of Skye. And we've got some more straight twill, but in more two-tone or monochromatic combinations, and some other lovely window panes, and a fancier twill on the bottom right-hand side. These are these 2x2 twills, and this is a really great illustration of 3 very different color combinations. And these are all woven on the same warp. So that purple stripe that appears on the cloth on the left is quite shadowed on the middle cloth by the green weft and darkened by the brown weft on the cloth on the right. So this is the kind of thing that you can have just by changing up the color of your weft and maybe adding or not adding that red and white sequence in there. And this is just a pretty picture of some tweed I found online. It's a really nice palette, and you've got a herringbone in there, you've got a gun club check, there's the Glen plaid at the very bottom. And I threw this one in because I wanted you to see that you can also have a tartan that is uses heathered yarns. So this is a very heathery tartan, a very tweedy kind of tartan. So there is some intersection between these cloths. And this came from this adorable jacket. Oh, there's a name for these with the little velveteen collars. I forget. It's like a kind of a hunting jacket. But anyway, I just thought it was just lovely, really lovely. Here's one more of those pretty pictures. We've got some 2x2s in here, quite a variety of tweeds, but it's the color that gets me. You can just play with color endlessly. This is from the Shetland Isles. I'll show you the label in just a minute. And this came from a sport coat that my father owned that I acquired when he passed away. My husband turned out to wear the same size coat he did. And so he got a lot of nice clothes when my dad passed away. And one day I had a closer look at this jacket and looked inside and found the label that showed me that it came from Shetland. It was hand woven on Shetland. And I adore the subtlety of this. It's gray from a distance, but it has this little bit of blue in it that makes it just a little bit more interesting. But I love the combination of the herringbone, the V section, with the basket weave section side by side. It's just a very interesting, but still very traditional tweed. And here's the label inside, which is lovely with the Viking ship and hand woven. And I never got to ask him where he got this coat. It's possible he bought it in the States, but he also liked to travel, so he may have picked it up. As far as I know, he never went to Shetland, but he may have found it in England. Then we have this funny area of tweed, which is all about color and weave. And color and weave in weaving is when you use a sequence of light and dark or colors, if you can use them with good contrast, and they create a visual effect. And I love this kind of cloth because it's sort of like a good joke. It's a weaver's inside joke because the color sequence gives a woven appearance to a cloth that is in fact woven. I just love that combination. So this particular fabric came from a kind of CPO type jacket, a shirt jacket that we used to wear in the 60s and early 70s. And I just love this sequence. And then this is another color and weave effect. This one is actually achieved, yeah, both in the warp and the weft with 3 white threads and 2 blue threads. And because the weave sequence is 4 steps, a twill sequence in a 4-shaft twill, 2x2 twill is 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 1 repeat. That's 4 different treadlings. And if you change your color in a sequence that doesn't match that, some interesting things can happen. So I love this cloth too. And then this is one last before we move on to talk about other things, which I can't see. Oh, no, I can see. We're going to talk about tweed yarn. This is back to that same Glen Club check. I took that sequence of, I think these are 8x8 stripes and a section of 8x8 stripes right through the rainbow, and then a section of 2x2 stripes. But I repeated that 2 times to make the colors come out even. And so this is a very traditional structure, but using color in not a very traditional way. But isn't it exciting? I think it's a really pretty piece of cloth. Okay, so one of the things about both the district checks, the state checks, and the tweed yarns, tweed fabrics, is that many of them use a tweed yarn. And that is a yarn that is not completely evenly solid. So when I was learning to dye, our goal was to make a perfectly smooth, even color, and that required a lot of stirring of the dye pot to keep moving the goods around so they didn't settle and get dark spots. Make sure your yarn is perfectly washed. Well, and that's a yarn dyed. That yarn, when it was used for fabric, that fabric could be called yarn dyed. For most of the tweeds, they took several different colors and blended them together, but did not blend them until it was completely homogenized. So this illustration is of a particular color called Love-It. And these are the component colors that go into Love-It cloth. So the greenish olivey bit at the right hand side is what happens when you combine all of these colors and blend them up to a certain point. And the Love-It color is intended to be a good camouflage in a particular part of the Highlands. And a lot of both the tweeds and the estate checks were designed to fit into that environment of that particular area, or to just make good camouflage for hunting. So these were used by people who wanted to go out in a world where there aren't very many trees. So they're blending with the bracken, the ferns, with the granite cliffs, with the color of the gorse and the heather, and just these different environments. And this is a picture from a mill that I visited in Ireland, in Donegal, and these little nubs of color would be blended with a whole lot of some other color of fleece in order to make the traditional Donegal yarn, which has these little pops of color in it. And sometimes they're quite unexpected colors. And I have to show you this terrible picture that was taken with long before I had an iPhone with amazing optics. This is the room in the mill in Donegal where they blended the colors. So they had very precise formulas that they would have, let's say, on a percentage system, if they would blend the colors with 100 grams of wool. So they might have 60 grams of a bright red and 10 grams of a brownish green and 10 grams of something else, and then 5 and 5 until you had 100, till you could add it up to 100. Well, they would weigh that out in some larger proportion based on that formula, put all of these colors together in this room. There's a hole in the floor and a vacuum system, and the little push broom is used to shove the wool towards the hole where it gets sucked down and comes up and falls from the ceiling. And there's a 2-armed ceiling fan that bumps it apart to break it up a little. And they send it through this this system in this little mixing room. I just can't believe how basic this technology is. And there's a man who would take the push broom and shove it back into the hole. And when it was sufficiently mixed, then they would take it out and put it through the carding machines. So that just fascinated me. I have a video of it, but it's so dark you almost can't see what's happening. So here's the still picture. Okay, we're going to look at our spinners because you can't have yarn until you have spinners. And these photographs are all from Donegal. Donegal is, oh, I should have a map. Next time I'll have a map. Donegal is in the northwest corner of Ireland. The counties that form Northern Ireland are in the northern portion, except for Donegal. Donegal really should belong to Northern Ireland, but the British didn't want it because it's not good for farming. The land is poor, and farmers could not even feed their families off of their land. And so in the 1860s, the government brought in spinning wheels from Holland, and actually that is one of what's considered a traditional Donegal wheel, the wheel closer to the fireplace. But its design came originally from Holland, and they brought in looms and they trained men to be weavers. And they started a tweed industry because they could raise sheep on that land that they couldn't raise enough food on. And by this, people were able to support themselves. So we have spinners in their little cottages, and sometimes they came outside to have their picture taken. And the lady on the right is holding a clou, C-L-O-U, a huge ball of yarn. When they spun the yarn, they would just keep winding it onto a ball and winding it until it was bigger than your head. And that's what they would carry off to the weaver. And here we have a lady spinning at a low wheel. This is the Donegal type wheel. And I was fascinated by these pictures. So this is how they did their warping. And this is called stake warping. So they would pound stakes into the ground and wind the thread from stake to stake. And we can see a little better what she's doing in this picture. So you can see the path of her stakes, and she's laid down some kind of cloth. I don't know if she always did that or if she did it for the photographer. She's not too worried about the yarn getting dirty because you can see she's standing on part of her warp in order to lean over far enough to wind. Now, in this country and in other parts of the British Isles, people used warping boards, or in Appalachia, sometimes people put their stakes for warping into the outside wall of a cabin, and there are photographs of women warping that way. So standing up. So this to me looks like a bad backache, but maybe she's good at it. Anyway, this is how they did their warping, early days. And here's a man weaving tweed in a very, very small house. And if you look to the left, there is a fly shuttle mechanism standing out to the side. The fly shuttle loom came into use in the 1780s, I want to say, and allowed weavers to produce much more quickly, but it meant that they had to have more spinners, and spinners had to work faster to keep up with the weavers. But it was one of the early major improvements to the speed of hand weaving. And here is a man, I think he's mending a broken thread because he's leaning up over top of his harnesses. This is myself and Eddie Doherty, who is one of the last of the hand weavers in Donegal, and his shop is in the town of Ardra in Donegal, which is a wonderful place to visit if you ever get a chance. And this is a factory in a nearby town which has quite a lot of looms, and this is the best image of the fly shuttle. So in order to operate the fly shuttle, you pull on this handle which launches the shuttle, and you can see the shuttle in this picture flying across the warp. It's got metal pointed ends. It bangs into that box, and the force with which the shuttle arrives resets the spring. So when the weaver pulls again, then the shuttle will fly out across. So he'll pull the handle, the shuttle will fly, he'll beat with the beater, he'll pull the handle kind of on the opposite diagonal, and the shuttle will fly again, and he'll beat. And he's also changing his treadles with his feet. So it's still hand weaving, but much faster than having to throw the shuttle by hand. And this is another blanket in that same factory. And it's one of the distinctions about Donegal tweed is that the yarn is thicker, the yarn is flecky, has these little bits of color. You can see how nubby this cloth is. And it's primarily at least the earliest Donegal tweed was primarily plain weave, but they do use a lot of twill, especially for blankets and throws, which is a lot of what they were weaving when I was visiting there. These are 2 rolls of blanketing that came from that same mill. And at some point when someone has time, whose job this is, they spread it out over a table and they mend it. So they look for any broken threads, they look for any knots, they weave in a thread alongside of it to cover the area where there's a break, and they just check to make sure that the cloth is just as it should be. And you can see the area that's going to be fringe in between 2 blankets, the unwoven portion on the table. And this is, actually this photograph was taken in Rosslare in Ireland, which is a central county, but it has the honor of having the most sheep of all of Ireland. And I asked everybody I met what kind of sheep they had, and they all said mixed. They all said they're cross. They call them cross. They were all crossbred sheep. They're primarily being raised for meat. And so they have crossbred to get the best carcass, is how shepherds describe it. And wool is still today, a secondary product. Okay, so here we're going to see some spinners. This is a lady, she's actually spinning flax. It could be long wool, but I'm pretty sure it's flax. But I want you to see the position that she's holding her hand with her spindle. She is using what I would refer to as a suspended spindle. She never lets go of her spindle. She can get up and walk around if she can hold her distaff in her belt or under her arm. And this is the type of spinning that was done for generations, particularly in countries without trees. Children of both sexes, young women, were sent out to watch the animals to keep them out of trouble, and they carried their spinning and spun constantly. Here we have a Scottish lady in the Hebrides, and she's using a muckle wheel, what we would call a great wheel, and she's spinning wool. And this is the type of wheel that in the older times was used to spin wool for tweed and blanketing. And she probably spun and wove everything she's wearing, which is quite a concept to think about. I have some pictures from the clearances, which is the time after Culloden when the government and landowners decided that they would have greater profit by having sheep on their land than people. And to get the people to leave, many of them emigrated to Canada and to the United States, and a little bit later to Australia. They would burn out their houses and literally just drive them away. And these are people who have been, you can see their houses burning way off in the distance, and people barefoot or nearly barefoot, not prepared for winter weather, out of doors. And this is what replaced them. We love sheep, but we also think people are important. And this is what you see today in many of these areas that were once more populated. You see the remnants of the black houses. Very simple stone cottages, but no roofs, no doors. These are women in Scotland collecting lichen to be used for dyeing. Lichen creates some really interesting colors and some very nice tweedy, kind of earthy colors. Here's a lady with a very deluxe dye setup. She's got a windbreak and a gigantic iron pot. She's just, she's really rolling in the high technology. Here's another lady. She's using a half an oil drum. She's about to put some fleece into her pot to dye. And this is an old engraving of women walking the cloth. And walking is spelled Waulking. Is not done today with feet, but clearly it was done with feet because here we have this engraving to show it. It's a way of finishing cloth so that, as I mentioned early in the slideshow, you can see the light between the threads when you take it off the loom. Once you have mended it and it's all ready to be washed and finished, then it would be wetted and then passed around, sewn into a loop and passed around the table. And the friction of the hands, or in some cases feet, and the friction of it on the table all start a fulling process. And this is the end of a fulling, a walking that we did at the John C. Campbell Folk School some time ago. That's me on the right. That's Norman Kennedy's head, my teacher and friend. And we've finished the walking and he's rolling the cloth up on a board, and then it will lean against a wall to dry for a day. Unwrap it, wrap the dry side in and the wet side out, leave it for another day. Then it will be dry enough to hang on a clothesline to finish drying. So he will roll it all the way up and then he'll turn it clockwise, sunwise, several times, and he has some Gaelic prayers that go with that. He's just getting ready to turn it. And this is another walking at the Campbell Folk School. And I'll go through it so you can see the cloth fly. So the singer, Norman, is at the end of the table acting as the singer. He sings a song that has a good solid rhythm, and so that the participants can grasp the cloth, lift it up, thump it on the table, and pass it along, all at the same rhythm and work together. And so you can see it kind of fly up in the air and come down again as they progress. So they pass that cloth around in a circle while they handle it. And it's a lot of fun. And I just thought I would show you some books at the end. There aren't a lot of books about tweed, and I have never found one book that answered all my questions, but these are some of the books that have been very helpful. And if you are interested in a book list, you can send me an email and I will send you my tartan and tweed resource list. Most of these, not all of them, but most of them are out of print, but there are some good places to get used books. And I also include a website that I particularly like on my list. So if you want to take a screenshot, here is my email address. You can write for a book list. Those of you on YouTube in the future can also request a book list. And also this program is sponsored by the Loudoun County Public Libraries, but it's also co-sponsored by the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge, which meets in Purcellville, Virginia, and that is the website of that guild. So now I get to find out if there are any questions.
Thanks so much, Melissa. You have just an unbelievable amount of knowledge about fiber arts. It's just fascinating to listen to you. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask Melissa? You can either type them in the chat box or tell me that you'd like to be unmuted and you can ask Melissa yourself. And Melissa, thank you for mentioning the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Fiber guilds are a wonderful opportunity. The Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge is focused on educating both the public and individuals who are interested in the fiber arts. We weavers would really like to make new weavers and to have this perpetuate. And one of the things I like best about teaching is the opportunity to pass on some of the knowledge that I've had the privilege of getting from Norman Kennedy. So we welcome people with no fiber experience, people with interest, people with whatever level of experience.
I'm glad you told us about that, Melissa, because someone just asked if there is a beginning weaving class somewhere. Where do they usually have their classes?
Well, they meet in the Old Depot in Purcellville, and some of the study groups meet in the library. There's a weaving study group that meets at Two Rivers Yarn, also in Purcellville. And this guild has we're in the process of starting a mentorship program. So we don't necessarily have beginning weaving classes, but you can sign up or request a mentor and work with someone. And the weaving study group is very happy to bring new weavers in and get them started.
Great. Fantastic. Any questions? No, everybody's so quiet today.
Okie dokie.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and check out the library schedule because I'm hoping Melissa will come back and do some things for us, either virtually or in person at one of our branches.
That would be nice.
It would be.
Yeah.